Hi chess friends, today we are going to witness Wesley's rook sacrifice and Magnus blunder. Magnus plays with white, Wesley is black. Magnus starts with e4, Wesley plays c5, knight to f3, d6, the Sicilian defense. Bishop to c4, keeps an eye on the weaker pawn f7, knight to f6, threatens the e4 pawn, d3, protects it, e6, castle on the king side, bishop to e7, black is also ready for castle. Usually white plays bishop to b3 or c3 or rook to e1, but Magnus goes for the unpopular move a4. Usually black plays castle on the king side or knight to c6 or a6, but Wesley plays d5. Now this is completely new game. Bishop to b5 check, king to f8. Slightly better is to block the check by knight to c6. Now black loses the castling rights. e5. Magnus kicks the knight back. Knight to g8. Bishop has no squares, so a5 creates escape square for the bishop. a6 attacks the bishop. Bishop to a4 moves it to safety. Queen takes a5 pawn. Black wins a pawn. Black needs to find a way to develop the kingside pieces. c4. Magnus wants to open the d file. d4. But Wesley wants to play closed game, as the king is still in the center. Knight b2 d2. Preparing knight to b3, which will attack the queen. Queen to c7. Knight to e4. Bishop to d7. Black's king has no squares, as white's bishop control the e8 square. So Wesley wants to exchange the strong bishop for his bad bishop. Bishop takes bishop on d7. Knight takes bishop on d7. Threatens the e5 pawn. Bishop to f4. Protects the e5 pawn. h6. Preventing any white pieces coming to g5 square. h4. g6. b4. Challenges the c pawn. C pawn takes b4 pawn. Knight takes d4 pawn. White's pieces dominates the center. Black has two passed pawns in compensation. Magnus sets a trap for black. If knight takes c5 pawn, knight to b5, a pawn cannot take the knight, as the rook on a8 is hanging. So queen to b8, d4, which will lose the knight on e5. Back to the position. So Wesley played rook to d8, queen to f3. Magnus planning to move the bishop to h2, so that queen will pin the f7 pawn to the king. Then knight takes e6 pawn, which will win the queen on c7. King to g7, moves away from the pin. Knight to d6. If the knight stays on the d6 square, it will be a big trouble for black, as it can take the f7 pawn and fork the rooks. So Wesley captures the knight with bishop. E pawn takes bishop on d6 and threatens the queen. Queen to c8. Rook f2 e1. Knight g2 f6. Finally develops the knight. Knight to b3. Rook h2 e8. Bishop to c1. Preparing bishop to b2, which puts more pressure on the knight on f6. e5. Blocks the knight in case bishop comes to b2 square. Bishop to b2. b6. Preventing knight to a5. g4. preparing g5 to threaten the knight on f6. King to g8, moving away from the bishop spin. Knight to d2, rook to e6, g5, h pawn takes g5 pawn, h pawn takes g5 pawn, knight to h7, threatens the g5 pawn, queen to g3, protects the g5 pawn, rook takes d6 pawn, trap is set for white. If bishop takes e5 pawn, let's see what happens. Knight takes bishop on e5, rook takes knight, rook takes d3 pawn, knight to f3, queen takes c4 pawn. Black has 3 extra passed pawns, which is winning for black. Back to the position. So Magnus played d4. Slightly better is rook to e3, rook takes d4 pawn, bishop takes rook on d4. Wesley exchange sacrificed the rook to create a passed pawn. E pawn takes bishop on d4. Rook to e7 was played, which is a mistake. Best move is queen to h4. Let's see the continuation. a5, king to g2, knight d to f8. There is no problem for white. Back to the position. Game continued as rook to e7. The problem with rook to e7 is that queen to c5, which will fork the rook and pawn on g5. But black played knight to c5, rook a to e1, rook to f8, queen to h4, b3. Wesley pushes the passed pawn. King to g2, preparing rook to h1. Slightly better is to play rook 1 to e2, queen to f5, going after the g5 pawn, and to exchange queens will lead to draw. Rook 7 to e5, attacks the queen and protects the g5 pawn. Queen to d7, rook to d5, threatens the queen again. Queen to c7, rook to h1, threatens queen takes knight on h7 checkmate. f6, now queen protects the knight. Knight to e4, knight also joins the attack. F pawn takes g5 pawn. It's good to eliminate the strong knight by knight takes knight on e4. Knight takes g5 pawn. It's good to play queen to h6, threatening g6 pawn, which gives more attacking options for white. Knight to d3 was played, which is a blunder. Best move is to play knight takes knight on g5. No need to worry about the queen to h8 check, as king can escape to e8 square via f7 square. There is no problem. Let's see the continuation. Rook takes knight on g5, queen to b7 check, rook to d5, queen to g7, and the game leads to draw. Back to the position. Game continued as knight to e6, forks the queen and rook. Not the best move. Best move is to capture the knight on h7 by knight, which wins the knight. Winning the knight is better than exchanging knight for rook. Queen to f7, creating a battery on the f file and threatens the f2 pawn. Queen takes knight on h7. Blunder by Magnus. Best move is to play knight takes rook on f8. Let's see the continuation. Knight to f4 check, king to h2, knight takes knight on f8. White has 2 rooks for 2 knights and 3 pawns. White has the upper hand. Back to the position. Game continued as queen takes knight on h7 check. This blunder turns the table from 3-point advantage for white to 6 tempi advantage for black. Queen takes queen on h7. Rook takes queen. King takes rook. It's better to capture the f2 pawn with rook with check, followed by king takes rook. Now black will have extra rook. Game continued as knight takes rook on f8 check, king to g8. Even though white has a extra rook, black's passed pawns cannot be stopped. Black is winning in this position. Rook to d6 goes after the b6 pawn. b2 preparing queen promotion. Rook takes b6 pawn. a5 pushing the a pawn to control the queening square, that is b1 square. Rook to b3. a4 attacks the rook. Rook cannot capture the knight as the b pawn will promote to queen. Rook to b8. a3 knight to e6 check, king to f7. Knight to g5 check, king to g7. Rook to b7 check, king to g8. Knight to e4. a2 knight to f6 check, king to f8. Rook to d7. Pause the video and find the winning move for black. Let's see the wrong moves first. A pawn promoting to queen and B pawn promoting to queen will lead to draw. Let's see how. Knight to h7 check, king to e8 or king to g8. Both the moves will met with knight to f6 check. King to f8 is forced. Then knight will continuously check the black's king and the game will draw by perpetual check. The only winning move is knight to f4 check. Wesley found out this move in just 3 seconds. King to f3, knight to h5, and Magnus resigned on move 56. Now there is no perpetual check and there is no way to stop the pawns from queening. So Magnus resigned. If you like the video, share, subscribe and like. Thank you. Post your suggested games in the comment section.